all the accounts say that he waited for a quarter mile further. They keep going, quarter mile past where he's supposed to give the signal. Perhaps it's because he's looking at all these women and children ahead of him. He finally turns his horse around and looks back at the men. And only then does he shout, "Halt." And the word halt was the signal for the killing to begin. John D. Lee alone has, this was years ago, he had over 100,000 descendants. Probably it's up to over 200,000 descendants. So one of these 50 to 60 men has that many descendants. So I kind of ballparked it. There were probably more than 1 million people alive today whose ancestors participated in this.
Yeah, Mormon church. You really encourage genealogy. I am doing it. I am the descendant of let's just say murderer. All right, genealogy. I'm doing it. And I'm not happy about the results. Welcome back to the Nuanto YouTube channel / the Mormon History Hoedown. I am Kara Burrell. Sometimes I go by Nuanto, and sometimes I get to be lucky enough to be friends with really amazing authors, historians, just basically directors of signature books, publishings, and authors / co-authors of real page turners like Vengeance is Mine. So welcome back to our multi-part series on this fantastic book that you wrote, Barbara, with, of course, the help of Richard E. Turley Jr., Vengeance is Mine, available wherever books are sold and also in audible form. Barbara Jones-Brown, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks, Kara. Thanks for having me back.
Do we like long-winded intros or do we not? Vote in the comments.
That wasn't that long-winded.
Well, as you guys know, I am so lucky to be sitting down here with historian Barbara Jones-Brown as we talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. We've done 2 episodes already that are available as a podcast under the Mormon History Hoedown and on my YouTube channel. So if you have not watched those before, we did an episode about blood atonement and just this violent rhetoric as it relates to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and then also a lot of the political influences and so many different people, factors, alliances that all led up to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, this really horrible, violent atrocity that occurred in 1857.
On September 11th.
1857. I just like to quiz you if you knew what year it was. I did.
I think I remember that.
Okay. So as much as I try to bring more lulls in this ex-Mormon space, I also try to bring on people like Barbara to tell us about impactful things that happen in Mormon history and U.S. history and go over the really intense details of these stories that really should be out there. People should be more knowledgeable about. But for this episode, we are going to get into a lot more of the, gruesome factor and things that you might need to take a moment to practice some self-care and some breathing work, because we're going to talk about the massacre itself. And as we were talking about, what could possibly have led these seemingly otherwise sane Mormons, hold your laughter, to act so insanely violently against this one group of immigrants from Arkansas, slaughtering 120.
Yeah, roughly 100 is what we found. Yeah.
Of innocent men, women, and children who truly did not do anything against them.
So yeah, in the first 2 episodes, as you mentioned, we talked about the political conflict that's going on between the federal government and the people of Utah Territory at the time, and also the religious factors that are leading to a culture of violent rhetoric and some violence. So we talked about the Mormon Reformation of 1856 and 1857 and the doctrine of blood atonement. So if people want to get more of that background, we encourage you to watch the first 2 episodes here. So today we'll talk about why, if, as I mentioned again in the first 2 episodes, why if several companies, immigrant companies, came under attack, had their cattle raided between September 7th and October 3rd, 1857, why was it that this one company is wiped out and massacred when in the cases of the other companies, we were able to document one immigrant being killed. But basically there was no killing of these other immigrant companies. What happened to this one that led to this? Yeah.
The Arkansas
So
immigrants.
what was supposed to be just a cattle raid, just running off the cattle, turned into murder because some of the immigrants were awakened and got out their guns and started firing on the people who were taking their cattle and the marauders. So some of the attackers are killed. We know of 2 who are killed, and then the several immigrants are killed in that initial, what was supposed to be just a cattle raid. So the immigrants circle their wagons, and then all of a sudden, you've got murder on your hands. And then some of the militiamen that are riding back to Cedar City to report what happened to Issac Haight, they come across 2 immigrant men who were rounding up stray cattle. They don't know what's happened. They fire on them, the militiamen, thinking they need to contain the situation. One of them, named William Aiden, is murdered. The other gets back into the corral, and then he can tell everybody inside the corral that white Mormons are involved in
way out of hand
this cattle raiding and in these murders now.
Mm-hmm. And with Brigham Young's eventual goal of exactly what to
backfired. Yeah. He was hoping through this strategy and through all of his policies to win public opinion for the Mormons against the President of the United States and win Congress's opinion for the Mormons against the President of the United States, James Buchanan, who had sent an army against U.S. citizens. But ultimately, the massacre would cast a very dark shadow on Brigham Young and his people for generations to come.
Mm-hmm. Sure wish that prophet, seer, and revelator could have prophesied, saw, or revelated not to do any of those things that we have to unfortunately read about in our history books and cry over in podcasts like this.
What happened is Indian missionaries, Latter-day Saint missionaries to the Indians, were encouraged to lead local tribes, local Indians, to participate in raiding these cattle companies. And so that is certainly the case of what happened at the Mountain Meadows, which is about 40 minutes north of St. George, Utah today. It's a highland valley. And a company from Arkansas were encamped there. They were on the trail heading for California. They were trailing a large herd of cattle. And they're encamped near a spring at the Mountain Meadows when in the early morning hours of September 7th, a Monday morning, they are initially attacked. And John D. Lee was a federal agent to the Paiute tribe at Ash Creek near Harmony, where he lived. And he leads a number of them there to the Mountain Meadows. But something goes wrong. Instead of just raiding the cattle, running off the cattle, the immigrants, they are awakened and they start firing on their attackers. They kill a couple of Native Americans and they quickly encircle their wagons and start digging in. And meanwhile, about 7 to 12, there's different accounts, but several immigrants are killed in that initial attack. So now all of a sudden you have murder. So the immigrants circle their wagons and they dig in, they entrench themselves inside. What happened is 2 of the Mormon militiamen who were there at the meadows, they see what's happened. They didn't just run off the cattle. These immigrants are dug in now and they're not going anywhere. And again, people have been murdered already. So 2 militiamen named William Stewart, and Joel White, they start riding back from the Mountain Meadows, riding back to Cedar City, Utah, to report to the state president of Cedar City named Issac Haight. He's also a militia major, and he's also the mayor of Cedar City. So he is the most powerful man in Cedar City.
And remind listeners how Issac Haight plays into the story from the last episode.
Sure. So I was talking about how powerful he was there in Cedar City, and we found that in August of 1857, he is writing Brigham Young about blood atoning, the blood atonement of a man named Rasmus Anderson, who had been engaged in repeated adultery against his, or what we would call sexual assault today, frankly, against his stepdaughter, who was only 11 years old at the
So
time.
he is the big man of Cedar City.
Big man,
and he's like, we have got some really underage hanky panky going on over here.
Yeah.
Brigham Young, what should I do with this guy?
Yeah. And he writes Brigham Young that I sent him to California, which is a euphemism for had him killed. And then through other accounts, we know that it was a case of blood atonement, that Rasmus Anderson offered himself up to atone for his sins by offering his own blood.
So there's all kinds of violent rhetoric coming out of Brigham Young. There's people who are
acting on it. And Issac Haight is one of them. And this, again, is August 1857, shortly before the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So that's just shows the mindset
of the people. The Southern Utah people, that's a wholly different story. No, just kidding. There's something wild, wild west going on outside of the bounds of the United States where the Mormons do not want to be invaded by the troops any longer. As your book says,
feel to be oppressed no more.
Oppressed no more. I was testing you to see if you knew your own time. Yeah.
They wanted to be oppressed no more, not fail to be oppressed.
What did I say?
They had failed to be oppressed in
I don't have enough brain cells to know what I said. Anyway, cut that out. Anyway, the point is,
they submit to oppression no more, is what Brigham Young says. So again, in the first 2 episodes, you can listen and learn about all these strategies in which they attempt to keep the troops out of Utah territory, and they are able to do that for one winter.
Okay,
keep them out.
So Issac Haight,
yes,
ironically, not a very loving guy. Go for it.
The 2 militiamen that witness this attack at the Mountain Meadows that turns deadly.
And we're saying militiamen meaning?
Mormon militiamen.
Militiamen.
So at the time, there wasn't the same kind of police force that existed in the United States. At the time, there were a lot of militias throughout the country. And so a militia was basically any man who was 18 or older was part of a militia. And they were there to kind of keep the peace. And then in 1857, when they hear that federal troops are coming on, then they become more warlike and they're preparing for a possible war with the federal government. So that's what a militiaman was. And again, any male 18 or over was just in the militia.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So 2 Mormon militiamen who were there at the attack, they witness what's happened. And so they start riding back from the Mountain Meadows, where these immigrants are now under siege. They've circled their wagons, literally. And they're going back to report to Issac Haight what they've seen, that there's been some immigrants murdered and that they're dug in and they're not going anywhere. So on their way back, they come across 2 immigrant men who were at a spring watering their horses. And these 2 immigrant men were not with the main company because they had been behind the main company rounding up stray cattle to bring them into the camp. So they're not aware of what has just transpired at the Mountain Meadows. They have no idea. They're just riding back with the stray cattle. These 2 militiamen, they come upon these 2 immigrant men, and they make the horrible decision that to contain the situation, they need to kill these 2 men, these 2 immigrant men. And again, those militiamen were Bill Stewart and Joel White. And they come across these 2 immigrant men. We know that one of them, his name was William Aden. And they fire on both of the immigrant men. They kill William Aden, but his companion, whose name we don't know, he gets away. And he starts riding towards the camp at the Mountain Meadows, again, not knowing that they're under siege, that they're under attack. The 2 militiamen, they follow him. They're not able to catch him. And then he's able to get inside the wagon corral where all of the besieged immigrants are inside. So now all of a sudden, everyone inside that wagon corral is a witness to the fact that Mormon militiamen are involved in this attack. It's not just Indians. So the local people are worried. What do we do? How do we handle this? What's the right thing to do? Issac Haight writes a letter to Brigham Young And he asks him, he explains what has happened. We don't know how much detail he goes into because unfortunately that letter doesn't survive. It was either destroyed or lost. We know it existed because multiple people write about the fact that he wrote this letter. And then we have accounts of people who talk about seeing the express rider who's carrying this letter from Haight to Brigham Young passing through their towns. And they're writing about what the letter says.
Mm.
So it says something to the effect of some immigrants are under attack at the Mountain Meadows. Probably says something about that they've been killed. Some of them have been killed, and just asking what we should do.
So that's from Issac Haight to Brigham Young, big man on Southern Utah campus, to the big boy up in Salt Lake.
Yes, to the biggest man, the most powerful man in Utah Territory. Yeah.
He asks him, "Do you like me?" Check box, yes or no. That's probably what it said.
That's it. So this express rider, his name's James Haslam. He's riding like crazy to bring it up to Salt Lake City. He gets there. He arrives in Salt Lake City and arrives in Young's office on September 10th, 1857. Brigham Young reads the letter from Haight and says, "Can you stand the ride back? Even though you haven't been sleeping this whole time." And Haslam says, "I think so." And he says, "Okay, go down, lie down for a little bit." And he composes a letter that Haslam then rides like the wind, bringing it back to Issac Haight. This was before the telegraph.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way that you could get things in Utah Territory quickly was having an express rider.
And I know you're more trained as a historian, not as an express rider of horses, but how long does that take?
So Haslam leaves on Monday afternoon, early afternoon. He arrives on Thursday.
So, and he hadn't slept the whole time?
Yeah, he's not sleeping.
Oh,
yeah,
goodness.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he was stopping to take he would change horses as he went, getting fresh horses to ride up to Brigham Young. So maybe he slept a few minutes here and there.
This is like
we don't know,
NASCAR of death.
Yeah.
In 1857.
Yeah.
Like, whoa.
Yeah.
This is again needs to be a movie.
Yeah.
I can just see the music.
It needs to be a movie.
I can hear the composition of the rider.
Right.
Yes. With the, and then it goes to and it's silent and it's darkness. And he's like running. And they're just a race against time here.
He walks into Brigham Young's office downtown, and Brigham Young's in a meeting with people. So the drama of him coming in, and and it's all in the book. We describe the drama, and Haslam handing it to Young, and Young looks at it, looks up, says, "Can you stand the ride back?" And then they compose a letter to send back. So I'll tell you what's in the contents later for the drama of the story.
Yeah, please do.
So that's happening. So meanwhile, the immigrants are under siege. There's 2 more attempted attacks made on them that are unsuccessful. I think it was 3 immigrant men. They leave the camp and they start heading north on foot, asking for help, looking for help. And as they're walking north towards the settlements, so in other words, towards Cedar City, which is the closest main settlement, some other militiamen, now that they've received word that this is going on, they leave Cedar City, a posse of militiamen, if you will. They come across these immigrant men. These immigrant men see them and they beg for help. And these militiamen gun them down. So, and then they also sent another immigrant man. He leaves looking for help, and he heads south on the trail towards California. He's just referred to as Young Baker. We believe that was George Baker, who had traveled this trail before to California. He knew where he was going. He was in his early 30s. And a little girl says that, who survives the massacre, she says that her pa got away. And her pa was George Baker. So that's why we conclude it's George Baker. Mm-hmm. And the Bakers were one of the larger contingents of this combined company of immigrants. George Baker, he is an immigrant man. He's a leader, one of the leaders of the train. His father, Jack Baker, is also with the train, and they have the largest contingency of cattle in this company. Another contingent is Alexander Fancher and his family. But it's important to not call it the Baker Fancher train, as we have done for a long time, because there were several different contingencies of immigrants in this train. So what they called them historically was the Arkansas immigrants, and that's what we call them in our book. So these two these two militiamen who had just killed William Aiden and tried to kill his companion, they arrive back in Cedar City. They report to Issac Haight that all of a sudden, all these immigrants in the middle of the encircled wagons now are witnesses to the fact that Mormons are involved in these attacks. White Mormons are involved in these attacks, and people have been murdered. So they start to worry, what are we going to do about this? Because we have the army coming from the east and the north, and if word gets out to California that we've been involved in all these cattle raids and we've killed people, then we're just going to have people from California coming up too after us.
Mm-hmm.
So they are in that midst of war hysteria. They're very concerned. And then they also are thinking about there's another cattle company that's behind this one that has come under attack. And they are just a day or two behind this one from Arkansas. So they reason this other company's coming. They're coming along the same trail. And pretty soon they're going to pass through the Mountain Meadows. And then they're going to see what's going on. And then you're going to have even more witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So Issac Haight and his advisors, John Higbee, who's one of his counselors in the state presidency, John D. Lee, and Philip Klingensmith, who's the bishop in Cedar City, they seem to be the ringleaders. And they make the horrible decision that they need to wipe all the witnesses out, except for the children who were, quote, too young to tell tales. And they use that expression repeatedly. So on Thursday, September 10th, on Wednesday, I think they leave late in the night on Wednesday, September 9th. Haight goes up to Parowan, Utah to consult with the state president there. His name is William Dame. And the reason why Haight needs to talk with Dame is the commander of the militia in southern Utah. So Haight needs Dame's permission to call out the full militia and carry out what he's proposing to do. He gets there to Parowan. Dame calls his council together to listen to what Haight is proposing, and Haight doesn't give him the full story. He simply says that the Indians have the immigrants pinned down, and the council says, well, they take a vote, and they said, help them on their way. Send some interpreters and help the immigrants on their way.
Whoa.
So that's what the initial decision is. But then Haight pulls Dame aside, and there's one other man who witnesses this, and this is how we know that it happened. His name was William Barton. Anyways, Haight pulls Dame aside, and he says, you don't have the full story. People have been murdered, and they know that we're involved. And if we let these people go on, all hell will break loose in California, and then we're really in trouble. And so Haight ignores the decision of his council and says, okay, do what you have to do. So he gives permission.
Dame gives permission?
To Issac Haight, yeah.
And says, you have the full force of my militia.
Yeah, William Dame is the only one who outranks Haight militarily in southern Utah. He's the commander of the Iron County Militia, is what it was called.
Mm-hmm. And then this Barton guy
he's witnessing it.
Yeah, got his ear to the wall or something.
He's with the two of them.
I'm trying to write the movie for Hollywood for us.
It's so dramatic. And listen to this. It's called the Tan Bark Council, or the Town Bark Meeting. A council, they use that term like we would say meeting. So it's called the Tan Bark Council, the three of them. And it's called that because they're sitting on some tanning bark. I guess you would use bark to tan leather. Yeah, it's stuff we don't understand. But anyways, they're sitting on a pile of tanning bark as they're talking.
Outside?
Yeah. Outside in the middle of the night. So Haight goes back to Cedar City. He calls out militiamen. He calls out, we looked at those who go to the Mountain Meadows, and most of them are leaders. They're leaders of smaller units within the militia. And they all seem to be handpicked who was sent out from Cedar City. Going from Cedar City, there are about roughly 40 men.
Handpicked for the loosest morals of the bunch, maybe.
Or just they're like leaders they're the leaders.
Have the most rounds of ammunition. Most likely to commit murder, whatever. When they filled out their application, they checked that box. Most
likely to obey their militia leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Haight also calls out a very young man named Nephi Johnson to go. Nephi Johnson is a missionary to the Paiutes, and he's fluent in Paiute. He's 22 years old. Nephi Johnson says he doesn't want to go, but Haight called him out, and he had to obey orders.
And was the story that the militiamen were given the liar one?
This is really...
Or did they know what they were signing up for?
So I'm so glad we can deep dive and so we can have these kinds of conversations. So many of these militiamen later say that Haight told them they were going out to help the immigrants who were under Indian attack, and to save them from Indian attack. That's what a lot of them say. And I used to go, I think that's just justifying or covering up on their part. But the more I studied it, the more I started thinking, and the more sources I saw, the more I started to think that makes sense. That's how he got them to go. Like we were talking about, how would otherwise basic, just normal, decent people participate in the massacre of men, women, and children? You know, if Haight truly did say, hey, I'm sending you out there to go rescue the immigrants, then they're going to say, let's go.
Anyways, we're under siege from the Native Americans is the story that they're told.
The story, yeah.
So again, like you mentioned many times before, it's like you can sell anybody a story based on those old racist stereotypes. Of
exactly.
You know how the Indians been bugging us?
Yes.
We have to stand in solidarity with our white immigrant brothers and sisters
who are under attack by the Indians. So anyways, that's what a lot of them say that Haight told them. And I've come to believe that might be true. But when they get to the Meadows, they're told something else, is what they say. So they arrive at the Mountain Meadows in the early morning hours of September 11th. They go into camp, they get a little bit of sleep. And then in the morning, they're called together by John Higbee. Again, that's Issac Haight's counselor in the state presidency. And he's also a militia major. They're called together by Higbee, and then they bring in John D. Lee, who's been leading it at the Mountain Meadows. And they are placed in a hollow square. And a hollow square is if you can just picture men standing in a square like this and then facing inward, and the leader is in the center. And a hollow square was a military formation in the 19th century in the United States. So they're placed in a hollow square, and then they're told what they're going to do.
And again, how many are in this square?
So approximately 40 men come from Cedar City. There are about a dozen men who come up from Washington, Utah.
Which always spells trouble. Men coming up from Washington, Utah, never ended with positivity. No offense, St. George.
So this was before St. George didn't exist yet in 57. So
I'm trying to post haste my insults to Southern Utah. Just kidding.
I love St. George.
I know. I'm just trying to infuse something.
You're just being
bullying people because I'm sad. Okay, go on.
Yeah. So Washington was just a brand new little settlement. And again, it was the precursor to St. George. So St. George later grew out of that settlement, but St. George did not exist yet. So about a dozen men hear that something's going on at the Mountain Meadows, and they decide to head up to the Mountain Meadows. We know that between the 40 or so militiamen that came from Cedar City and the dozen or so militiamen that came from Washington, Utah, that came up from the south. That and then there were a few militiamen who were living at the Mountain Meadows at a ranch in the north end of the meadows, Jacob Hamlin's ranch. That there were between 50 and 60 white militiamen who participated. So they get to the meadows, and then the leaders, they have a meeting. The leaders meet about it, and the ones that have just come from Cedar City, they said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to decoy the immigrants out. We're going to tell them that we're there to save them. And we're going to convince them to give up their guns and come out of the wagon corral and start walking back towards Cedar City. And then we're going to massacre all of them. And so the leaders who had been at the Mountain Meadows, and then some of the leaders that had come from Cedar, they say, what? And they have to have a meeting about it. They're sitting in a circle. And they're like, how can this be okay? You know, how can we do this? And the discussion is, well, if we let them go to California and they report in California what's happened here, then all hell's going to break loose. They're going to send an army of volunteers up from California, and they're going to kill our women and children. So better theirs than ours. And they make this horrible decision. Okay, let's do it. So then they place the militiamen who are there and who have come out from Cedar City and who have come up from Washington in a hollow square. And they stand in the middle and they tell the men what they're going to do, what the plan is. And then they immediately march the men down to right up to near where the corralled immigrants are. So the militiamen are standing there in a line along the trail. And one militiaman, his name is William Bateman. He walks out with a white rag on a stick, which symbolized, we're here to help you. The immigrants had raised a white rag on a stick in the middle of their corral the whole time they've been under siege, which is a symbol for help, saying help us. So a militiaman walks out with a white flag. The immigrants don't shoot him. And they say, okay, yeah, we'll talk with you. Then he walks back, and then John D. Lee walks out with a white flag. So I think they sent the first one, William Bateman, to see if he'd be shot by the immigrants. Who knows? But it's interesting. He walks out when they say, okay, yeah, we'll talk with you. He comes back, and then John D. Lee comes back. And they let John D. Lee inside the corral. And this is about noon on September 11th. We know that because he describes the sun being high in the sky. And he meets with the immigrant leaders, and we don't know exactly what their names were at this point. Some of them have been killed in the prior attacks. But Lee says, okay, the Indians are mad at the men. They're not mad at the women and children. They're mad at the men. But we're going to help you. So if you turn over your guns to us, put them in the back of one of our wagons we'll bring in, we will escort the men out. You know, we will walk next to them and escort them and protect them from further Indian attack. And the women and children, the Indians aren't mad at them, so they can just walk ahead. So we want you to turn over your guns, and then we'll escort you safely back to the settlements. The immigrants inside, there's a debate, and one of them says, okay. And then another one says, don't you be such a damn fool as that to turn over your guns. And one of the immigrants says, well, he promised us peace. And the other one says, if you turn over your guns, you're a damn fool. The immigrants are desperate. They've been inside this wagon corral for 5 days in the heat. If any of you have ever been in southern Utah in September, you know how hot it is. They are just out of reach of the nearby spring. They're not able to get to that. They're out of water. They're so thirsty. They're out of ammunition from defending themselves from these attacks. And so they really had no choice but to trust. And I think that they couldn't imagine that other white men, other white people would kill them for no reason. So they're desperate. So they say, okay, we're going to do it. So John D. Lee he directs 2 wagons driven by 2 Mormon militiamen inside the corral. The immigrants let them inside. One is driven by a man named Sam Knight, and the other is driven by a man named Sam McMurdy. They go inside the corral, and they put all of their guns. The immigrants put all of their guns in the back of one of the wagons. They also load it with truck was the word, but that means baggage, because they really think they're going on a journey. They just didn't know how short that journey would be.
Mm-hmm.
And they put some of the wounded who've been wounded in earlier attacks and some of the youngest children. They're wounded or holding some young children. So John D. Lee says, I'm going to lead these wagons out. The wagons will leave first, and then the women and children will follow next. And then the men will follow last. And they're going to walk alongside the militiamen who are waiting there to escort you back to safety. So John D. Lee walks out first, leading the 2 wagons. And then this large group of women and children walk out next. I can't imagine what the militiamen who are standing there in the line are thinking as they see all these children mostly pass them, and they know what's going to happen.
Right.
It says that, the accounts say that the militia leaders, John M. Higbee, hurries them past. He rushes them past the militiamen. And I wonder if it's because he didn't want the other militiamen standing there to think too much, too much time to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the women and children are walking behind the wagons. And then John M. Higbee, who's the leader at the Meadows, he's on horseback. There's only 2 men on horseback during this attack, 2 Mormon militiamen. John M. Higbee is on horseback behind the women and children. And then come the men, the immigrant men, being escorted by an armed militiaman. There's an armed militiaman standing next to every immigrant. And then finally behind that, there's a man named Dan McFarland, who's Issac Haight's stepson. He's on horseback. So the procession starts walking. And the immigrant men, when they come up to the militiamen, they raise a cheer for them, thinking that they're there to rescue them.
Right.
There's also an account of one of the immigrant men. He's younger, probably maybe an older teenage boy, who turns around and goes back into the corral like, I can't do this. And they have to talk him in to, no, come with us, it's going to be okay. And he suspects sabotage.
Mm.
So they march forward for about a mile northward in this procession. And then they come to a place on the road, on the trail, that's thickly wooded with sagebrush and oak scrub on both sides of the trail. And there, Nephi Johnson is hiding with Paiutes and other attackers. Nephi Johnson has been told to bring the relatively small number of Paiutes who are there up there for their role in the attack. When the wagons get to that point and the women and children are in that thickly wooded area, John M. Higbee was supposed to give the signal for the killing to begin. All the accounts say that he waited for a quarter mile further. They keep going, quarter mile past where he's supposed to give the signal.
Mm.
Perhaps it's because he's looking at all these women and children ahead of him. He finally turns his horse around and looks back at the men. And only then does he shout, "Halt." And the word halt was the signal for the killing to begin.
Wow.
So at that point, the militiamen turn to the immigrant man at their left, fire on them, shoot them point blank in the head, the face.
So you're saying like 50, 60 of these militiamen who are all standing alongside these unsuspecting immigrants. Mm-hmm. They all have a weapon on them. They're
all carrying their guns.
Yeah.
And again, they're carrying their guns and saying, "Oh, well, we're here to escort you."
Yeah. And then just straight point blank, just boom. Right all at the same time.
Boom. Yeah. At that signal of halt. Yeah. So Yeah, so 2 militiamen are driving the wagons. John D. Lee's ahead of them. That's 3. John M. Higby is on his horse between the women and the men. That's 4. Dan McFarland is at the very back. That's 5. And so whatever is remaining, they're walking alongside with the immigrant men.
Okay. And then the women and children are where in that line again?
They're right behind the wagons and ahead of the men.
Okay.
So
but they have to hear all of this breaking out.
Oh yeah. So they're about a quarter mile. They're walking about a quarter mile ahead of their men. And so the militiamen fire on the men to their left. And then the attackers that are hiding in the sagebrush and oak, they descend on the women and children and wipe them out. And the women and children, we have one witness who describes this. His name was William Young, no relation to Brigham. But he's up at the camp and he's watching this whole thing and he describes what he sees. Also, Nephi Johnson is also up on the hill. He describes seeing it. He says he doesn't participate. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but he describes what he sees as well, and their accounts line up. So when that initial firing happens, the women and children, and then they're being rushed upon and attacked, they start running back towards their men.
Oh.
Not knowing that their men have just been murdered, like they've just been shot too. So there's like this huge scream breaks out, collective scream, and they start running for their men. And they're wiped out. They're hewn down and killed with clubs and rocks and arrows and knives and guns. John D. Lee and the 2 men in the wagons killed wounded and that are in the back of the wagons as well. There's accounts that John D. Lee killed about 5 or 6 people. Sorry, it's really hard to talk about.
This is what we were saying last time. We're listening to this when I set up this room, and
it's brutal.
You need to pause and cry. And you were saying, when you're researching this, you have to close your door, and got PTSD symptoms from researching this so heavily.
Oh yes.
So yeah, intense as it gets.
So Nephi Johnson later says that the killing took about 5 minutes to wipe all those people out.
That's insane. Just no care for the humanity. Wow.
So after the killing ends, the looting begins. And there's accounts of John D. Lee and other leaders going up to the bodies and looting all the bodies, pulling out watches, any money, that kind of thing. The clothing is stripped from the bodies.
They're still warm before they have.
Yeah. Clothing was so, just clothing. You just think of the poverty of just clothing was valuable. So they stripped the bodies. And then Philip Klingensmith, the Bishop of Cedar City, he goes north. He goes all the way north to where the children, there's still a few children who are alive, and these are the youngest children. And they're screaming. They're wandering around. Some of them are still in their mother's arms, their babies. And he takes the very youngest ones and puts them in the back of one of the wagons. And there are accounts that any children that looked too big to tell tales, they're murdered. And one girl says that they shot another girl right in front of them. So 17 children. And again, the oldest was 6. And most of them were toddlers or babies aged 2 and under. So they put them in the back of one of the wagons, and Samuel Knight, who was living at the Mountain Meadows at Hamlin's Ranch, he's working for Hamlin's Ranch. He and his wife had just had a baby, and they draw the wagons north to Hamlin's Ranch, where Jacob Hamlin is not there. He's in Salt Lake City, being sealed to his second wife, his plural wife. They bring them to Rachel Hamlin, who is Jacob's wife. And she looks in the back of these wagons, and there's these screaming, bloodied, traumatized children.
17?
At 17.
Yeah.
One girl, she's just 1 year old, a little Dunlap girl. Her arm, a ball they're called balls back then, not bullets. It was a ball, had broken the two bones of her forearm, and it's just hanging there.
Yeah.
Another girl has been wounded on her ear, and they've been suffering for 5 days even before the massacre. If you think about it, they're just filthy after being corralled stuck in this corral for 5 days. She takes them in and cares for them through that first night. She didn't know what was going on. It's horrible what was done to her and her children. So she and her children, her older children, must have cared for those babies through the night. And her adopted Shoshone son, his name is Albert, he says that the children cried all night.
Yeah, I cannot imagine the amount of
trauma.
Everything from kids not knowing where their mommy went, and like breastfeeding babies and things.
I know.
And every single different, I can't imagine, like infection and what you'd need to be able to take care of so many children in such filthy, horrible situations. And all of that was kind of placed in the lap of one family.
Yeah. And then, so I assume that Caroline Beck, Caroline Beck Knight, that Samuel Knight's wife, who was living at the Mountain Meadows working for the Hamlins, Samuel Knight, she just had a baby. So maybe she helped nurse those nursing babies through the night. We don't know the details. We just know that the children cried all night. We have that account.
That must have been horrific.
I can't even imagine.
Horrific.
I can't even imagine.
I guess I never really thought about very strongly is because I think when we're considering all of these different wagon trains that are leaving, and I've read like Devil's Gate and about all the immigrants that traveled out. And sometimes it feels hard, unless there's a journal or something, it feels hard to like actually know exactly who was leaving on these trails. But what I've noticed from this book is how well documented each of these sometimes quite wealthy people from Arkansas, how well documented it was exactly who left in what company at what time, that helps account for who exactly was killed, and then how to find what children they left behind, who's missing, to fill in the blank. I guess I never really put together that I just kind of imagined like Little House on the Prairie, and you just peace out from some town and nobody really knows you're gone. I don't know, but it's quite different. Like these people had families and entire established businesses, and it was a real farewell to watch them, journey out to California or move back and forth and carry their stuff.
And it's important to us that all of these people aren't just nameless, faceless victims, but, we share their names and we talk about them in their lives so they become humanized. So,
yeah, that's a beautiful part of history and storytelling and the whole, well-rounded completeness of somebody's life, not just being marked by what some really heinous things that happen to them are. Right. But these are people who are also trying to make a better life.
Their way to California, searching for a better life in the nation's newest state. So,
which I've always said, I can't. Number one reason Brigham Young, for me, isn't a prophet is he said this is the place when it was like California is available. Technically, are you just not wanting to be carried in your cart anymore? Did you hear of Santa Monica yet? So,
right. Yeah. Well, they were looking for total isolation where they can be away from all other white people.
I think he was just tired after he got out of Immigration Canyon.
Well, he did have mountain fever. He was sick.
What's that mean?
Mountain fever is, I think it's the same as malaria.
Oh.
But it's like a tick-borne disease.
Poor Brigham.
But we digress.
Poor Brigham. You've spoken so eloquently from your heart, but I just wanted you to speak to why it's so important to tell this story or what you want people to concentrate on when we're telling this story.
Yeah, what I hope comes of it.
Yeah.
And as I've repeatedly said with you a few times already, it's important to study these difficult parts of our history, whether it's our nation's history, our religion's history, our state's history, so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and not repeat them. And so I hope readers will come away despising the evil of what was done, despising these horrific acts, despising murder, but not despising anyone who's alive today who's not responsible for it, not despising Mormons in general or Latter-day Saints in general because of these acts of the past. I think it's possible to do both, to be able to separate that.
Yeah, that's really well put. And as we talk more about what came out after this massacre and come to find out what role the church played and what leaders did what, and then the legacy, all of this happening up until the present day, and what the LDS church was made aware of and what they weren't, what they apologized for, and all of the other things that I think people are going to be interested in of what is the modern LDS church that's like run by, President Nelson right now. How does that connect to this, and what more could church leaders or Mormons do? Because I totally agree that it's not the individual member of the church.
Between 50 and 60 militiamen who participated in this, whose names we know.
50 and 60?
Between 50 and 60, yeah.
Whose names we know, and that so many people are like, my great-great-grandfather was Joseph Smith's bodyguard, and they'll have a story about some pioneer heritage or something.
Just the happy stories or and whatever.
At least
but
50 or 60 people, how those genealogies work.
Exactly. And
that's a lot of people.
Many of these men were polygamous.
Yeah.
John D. Lee alone this was years ago, he had over 100,000 descendants. Probably it's up to over 200,000 descendants. So one of these 50 to 60 men has that many descendants. So I kind of ballparked it. There were probably more than 1 million people alive today whose ancestors participated in this, and we just don't know. We just don't know their names. Incidentally, I found out that my great-great-great-grandfather was one of those men. I found this out.
You're kidding.
Years into working on this project.
Years into working out, you
looking
recognized
at some genealogy I wasn't aware of. Yeah. And this is interesting, is my friend Sandra Tanner. Her great-great-great-grandpa also was one among those 12 men. So ancestors together went to the Mountain Meadows.
And you know who else?
Who else?
Who did the Mormon Stories episode with you? Rebecca Biblioteca.
Oh, yes. Her ancestor came from Cedar City. Ira Allen.
Oh.
Yeah, I was thinking I was so unique. What a coincidence. I happen to be a descendant. But then I've met so many people as I've shared this work. I've had so many people come out of the woodwork to me, either at events where I'm speaking or on social media, and say, I just learned I'm a descendant of a perpetrator.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I started doing the math, and I thought, there are a lot of us.
And they all have Mormon X Mormon podcasts, or they're involved in this space. Except for me, I'm clean.
Yeah. So I kind of thought I was just.
Holy crap.
Yeah. So be careful about looking at your genealogy, folks.
Yeah, Mormon church. You really encourage genealogy. I am doing it. I am the descendant of a
Mountain Meadows Massacre perpetrator.
Let's just say murderer.
Sure. Murderer, perpetrator, it all.
Are we allergic to saying too many M's after we say Mountain Meadows Massacre murders?
It is a lot of M's. It's a lot of alliteration.
All right. Genealogy, I'm doing it. And I'm not happy about the results that I find.
Yeah. If people want to see the full list, they'll need to look at Massacre at Mountain Meadows, the first volume in the series, and in the appendices. We have the names of all of the militiamen known to have participated. We also have the names of all of the immigrants known to have been in the company. And so they can look at those appendices and look at those names.
Holy moly. And I know that just as a listener and a person who's interested in history and all of these things, how profound of a work that must have been to compile that. But I can only imagine for the descendants, how important that is to be able to...
Descendants of victims.
Yeah, descendants of victims, to be able to put those pieces together and feel like their names are honored. So that is incredible. That's huge.
Yeah. I hope these books honor them.
Wow.
The victims by telling their story. They're gone. We can't bring them back. But by telling their story, making sure they're never forgotten, that's the best way we can honor them today. That and protecting the land where they remain.
Yeah. Do you mind if I read some quotes from the book?
Mm-hmm.
So tell me what this is going on here. So after the militia men marched the company for a distance, the immigrant men were all shot dead at the first fire, Lee said, with the exception of a few. He did not say how the women and children were killed, And so Schertz later asked Indians, the women and children were knocked down with stones, clubs, and gun barrels, they told him.
Oh, Annie Hogue.
Hogue.
Yeah, she was living in Harmony where John D. Lee lived, and she reports what John D. Lee is telling the congregation. Initially, he's bragging about what's happened before Brigham Young's letter arrives.
So now you see why I wanted to leave on this kind of cliffhanger of the ways that they were initially hyping up what they were doing.
Yeah, it's
to then try to blame it on everything but themselves.
Including, and I should say that the Paiute people were victims in this as well, because their plan from the beginning was to blame all of this on the Indians.
That they were conned into kind of doing it in the first place.
Into participating, yeah.
And then not knowing that once they participated, they'd be blamed for it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's and the Paiute people have had to carry that burden and be blamed for it for generations as well. That's another thing that we really tried to clear up with this book, is make it clear that this was orchestrated, planned, and largely carried out by white men. And so the blame, the focus needs to be on them.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is obviously just so heartbreaking in a million different ways, but I also just like to bring things back to our current day and age and infuse a little bit of humor in any way that I can. So what you just described, like if you've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist who coaxes you into things and then blames you for it, you would understand the frustration to a small degree that is going on in this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Right on, girl. High five. Okay. So according to Hogue's recollection, Lee told his congregation about encountering an immigrant man holding his baby. Should I read this?
You go.
Okay.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Give up that child, Lee demanded. The immigrant seemed to know Lee and his beliefs. No, Lee, he replied, I recognize you, and you know the penalty of shedding innocent blood. If Lee was going to shoot, the man said, Lee would have to kill the child too and bear the consequences. The Bible condemned those who shed innocent blood, meaning those who were blameless, and Latter-day Saints taught that shedders of innocent blood forfeited their chance to enter the highest heaven. Lee gave the immigrant another chance to hand over the baby, but he refused. Then Lee told the congregation, it was my turn to shoot. We will continue next time on more of that.
One of the most
hideous
stories
of all time.
So I think next time we can talk about like what happens immediately after.
Okay.
Burials, and then going back, and like at first they're all rah-rah to their congregations. And then Young's letter arrives and they're like, oh, whoops. And then they start covering it up.
And the blame gets passed around like a hot potato.
To the Indians.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's why I say they're victims too.
Yes. Well, you did such insanely and thorough research on such a heartbreaking, harrowing topic. Mm-hmm. So I can't thank you enough, Barbara, for spending time with me and telling this story. Just something so difficult to talk about. But
you know what kept me going?
Yeah.
Was I was doing this for the victims.
Mm-hmm.
I so wanted to get in a time machine and go back and be able to stop what was happening. But of course we can't. And it was tearing me up inside. I could do nothing for those people. But then when I started to meet their descendants, I realized there was something I could do for them. And that was their descendants told me, you can tell the truth about what happened to them and make sure they're not forgotten. So that's what kept me going through how hard it was to work on this project for 18 years, was this is a service I could do for those people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I thank you too for putting your time, mind, effort, soul into something that means so much to the descendants, means so much to just this Mormon, post-Mormon community, American, there's Indigenous people. I'm sure there's just so many people who are just, 3 cheers for Barbara.
Thanks. I hope we can just all learn from it and be better after learning of it.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah. Thank you, Kara. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk so much about it and share this story far and wide.
I'm in it with you, sister. Thank you for everybody who listens to the Mormon History Hoedown, who supports the Nuance Ho YouTube channel, patreon.com/Nuance Ho over at Hoetown. We just hit 400 residents of Hoetown over there, and you can get all of this content ad-free. and a bunch of other really fun perks. Apple, Spotify, leave a good review. That would really mean a lot. I'm giving you a lot of tasks right now. I hope that you're writing them down. Dun, dun, dun. There's at least 10, but the last thing you need to know is give yourself a hug. Love you so much.